what is a bruiser? Well, on the sliding scale of survivability versus damage, bruisers are right in the middle. They do damage. They go to do a good amount of damage, but not as much as a carry. And they can take a good amount of punishment, but not as much as a tank. Now, they'll still survive better than a carry, and they'll still do more damage than a tank, so they sort of fall right in a nice little area in the middle where they're sort of a jack of all trades. Now, what makes a bruiser? Again, we talked about survivability versus damage. They typically use a combination of abilities and auto attacks to deal the damage. If they were straight auto attacks, they'd typically just be considered a melee AD carry and thus not viable. And they have sort of a mix of burst and sustained damage, corresponding again to their abilities and their auto attacks, i.e. the abilities do a lot of burst damage, and the auto attacks are more of a sustained over time damage. So what does a bruiser do? A bruiser waits until the tank initiates the fight. If your team doesn't have a tank, it will typically fall to the bruiser as the next tankiest person to initiate the fight. But ideally, you'll wait until the tank initiates the fight, and then they will jump on the enemy carry or caster. And because they have a good amount of damage, and because they also have some survivability, they can typically outlast the carry or the caster in one-on-one combat. And so, by doing that, by jumping on the enemy damage dealers, they're able to take focus off of the rest of the team, and will typically survive to start focusing other members of the enemy team as well. Excuse me. Some examples of bruisers: Nasus, Wukong, Lee Sin, Warwick, Xin Zhao, people. I'm tired of people saying Xin Zhao or Xin Zhao or however you say it. It is Xin Zhao. X is pronounced as an SH in Chinese. Get it right. Off my soapbox. Xin Zhao, Garen, Hecarim, and Darius, all of these are qualified as bruisers. And again, if they have some sort of sustain or some sort of, they have a sustain or they have some sort of innate tankiness, like a shield, Riven would be a good example, and they also do a mix of damage and survivability, then they can be considered a bruiser. And I don't know of any bruisers that are ranged. I'm pretty sure that all of them are melee.
Yes.
So the next category we want to talk about is support. And now what makes a support? Now, on the damage versus survivability scale, they're actually not anywhere on it, because a support doesn't do a whole lot of damage, and some of them are pretty squishy. There are some that end up building tanky, but in general, they don't really do any damage. They don't show up on the damage scale, and they're not terribly survivable either. So they're not really on the scale at all. They're sort of up here. Now, in use, they sort of function like a caster, i.e. most of their utility comes from their abilities. They're not going to be auto-attacking for lots of damage, and so that really just leaves their abilities as their one real trick. So what makes a support a support? They either have lots of crowd control, or a sustain or defense of some kind, or a healing ability. If they have any two of those three, then they can typically be considered a support. For example, actually, we'll go with that. What does a support do? In the early game, the support's job is to babysit the AD carry, because the AD carry has a responsibility to get lots of gold. They're very dependent on items to be able to do their damage late game. Whereas a support, their job is to simply sit back, make sure the carry doesn't die, sometimes to help them get kills, and to give the carry lots of gold and make sure that they survive so that later on in the game they can be, dealing absurd amounts of damage through right-clicking. Late game, in team fights, a support just sits back and keeps the whole team buffed, and they do damage to weak targets to sort of augment team damage. You're not going to find a support taking on a tank 1v1 because that would be suicide. You're not going to find them really taking on anybody 1v1. They're just sort of there to augment the team damage a little bit, but mostly just to make everybody else a little bit better. Some examples of supports. For example, we have the tank or crowd control supports. For example, Taric, Alistar, Blitzcrank, Morgana to an extent, Janna, and Lux, if you can really count. Lux is sort of CC-ish. She's not very tanky, but she's got a lot of good CC. And you'll note that Morgana and Janna and Lux are all casters as well. I mean, Janna's primarily support, but Lux and Morgana are considered casters. But certain casters can also function as carries, or not carries, supports. My apologies. So you have those tanky or crowd-controlled supports. And on the other hand, you have the sustain or shield supports. For example, Soraka, Sona, Karma, Janna. Alistar has some sustain. Morgana and Lux have shields. Tarek's got a little bit of sustain to him as well. Excuse me. So you have two schools of thought when it comes to supports. You have let's take lots of damage and do lots of crowd control so that we can get kills for our carry and protect them from incoming ganks and from the enemy team. And a lot of times that also necessitates sacrificing yourself for the carry, but that is the job of the support. And then, on the other hand, you have the sustain or shield supports, which is simply saying, I'm going to make sure the carry can stay in lane, farming, getting as much gold as long as possible. And they're both very viable schools of thought. Personally, I prefer the tank or the CC supports because I like doing things rather than just sitting back and healing. But that's all up to preference. And then finally, we have somebody who's not really typically on the normal team roster, and that's an assassin. And an assassin is still a team role, a character role. And they sort of fall under the caster category because primarily, again, they use their abilities for damage. They rely very much on those abilities to do lots of damage very quickly. So what makes an assassin? Lots of front-loaded burst damage. I mean, you get in, you do a lot of damage really quickly, and then you just get the hell out. Typically they have some sort of stealth, they have a distance closer because a lot of them are melee, and then they have a disable or some sort of crowd control in general. Now, what does an assassin do? Early game, the assassin lanes like everybody else, annihilates their opponent, and then goes to gank other lanes and finish off kills for lots of gold and experience. And late game, the assassin waits for the fight to start and then focuses on the high damage targets, for example, the carry and the caster, sometimes the support, because supports do increase the power of a team in a team fight. And they're typically quite squishy. So an assassin will go in, annihilate our targets of opportunity, and then escape before anybody can focus them down. Excuse me. Some examples of assassins: Talon, Shaco, Twitch, Evelynn, Akali, and also a caster, Ahri, is technically classified as assassin because of her mobility, her lots of front-loaded burst damage, and that ultimate which gives her 3 dashes and enables her to just sort of finish off fleeing people. I don't know, I don't really think of her much as an assassin in the typical sense, but Riot has sort of classified her as an assassin mage, so I'll go with it. So that is the conclusion of the episode. In this episode we talked about the several different types of characters, what makes each type of character, what their role is in a team fight, and gave you some examples. Now feel free to look up more examples. You can typically find them. There are all kinds of lists on the internet. The internet is a wonderful place for finding any sort of information. And so I encourage you, if you have any questions, you can look it up. You can also send me an email at the link in the description below to that email address. You can, if you want a question answered or you want to see a kind of episode, you want a suggestion, you want to send me a suggestion for an episode, please, by all means, I take all kinds of suggestions, criticisms, constructive criticisms, preferably. But if you want to flame me, do so. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm looking for ways to better myself in any way I can. So bring it. With that said, if this was informative to you, please, by all means, like, favorite, subscribe, whatever you want to do. Show your support in a positive way, and that really helps me out. So, links down below. Until next time, I will see you. Keep on owning Summoners. Peace out.